Commander HFY clicked his mandibles in satisfaction as he watched the transport ship's engines dim in the cargo bay. Another successful raid on the primitive Outer Rim worlds. The Krillian Empire had been expanding for 3 centuries, consuming worlds and civilizations like a cosmic plague. Today's target had been particularly easy. A small human colony on the edge of known space. The humans were pathetic, really. Soft-skinned bipeds who had barely mastered interstellar flight. Their weapons were crude kinetic projectiles and basic energy weapons that could barely scratch Krillian armor. Most had surrendered immediately when the Imperial fleet arrived, dropping to their knees and begging for mercy in their squeaky, emotional voices. "Sir, the cargo manifest shows we've secured 73 slaves, including several breeding pairs," reported Lieutenant Vexmore, his scales gleaming under the harsh ship lights. "Most are standard human stock, but we did capture something unusual." HFY turned his reptilian head toward his subordinate. "Unusual how?" "A human female and her offspring. The female fought differently. She killed 18 of our soldiers before we managed to subdue her with neural disruptors. The colonists seemed terrified of her, calling her names in their primitive language. Something about a witch and Baba Yaga." The commander's interest piqued. Humans rarely fought effectively against Krillian forces. Their emotional nature made them predictable and weak. But 18 kills. That was impressive, even if it was just luck. "Show me this female." They walked through the ship's corridors, past other cargo holds filled with stolen resources and terrified colonists. The Krillian Empire had perfected the art of conquest. Strike hard, take what was valuable, and leave the rest to burn. It was efficient and profitable. The special containment cell was reinforced with triple-layer energy barriers. Inside, a human female sat cross-legged on the floor, her arms wrapped around a small child who couldn't be more than 10 standard years old. The woman's dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and her green eyes held a coldness that made even HFY's predator instincts twitch uncomfortably. "She hasn't spoken since we brought her aboard," Vexmore explained. "The child keeps asking for his mother in their language, but she just stares. It's unsettling." HFY activated the cell's communication system. "Human female. Identify yourself." The woman slowly raised her head, meeting his gaze directly. Most humans cowered when faced with a Krillian commander's presence. This one looked at him like she was measuring him for a grave. "My name is irrelevant," she said in accented Galactic Standard, her voice carrying an odd rhythm that seemed to echo strangely in the metal corridor. "But you should know that you have made a terrible mistake." "The only mistake was your resistance." HFY clicked his mandibles in what passed for Krillian laughter. "You killed some of my soldiers. I'll grant you that. But now you and your spawn will serve the Empire until you die. Your world burns behind us, and your people scream in chains." The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around her. The lights flickered momentarily, and the ship's environmental systems made a sound like distant thunder. "You don't understand," she said softly, stroking her child's hair. "You think you've captured prey, but you've made yourself the hunted." "Threats from a defeated primitive amuse me," HFY said, but he found himself stepping back from the cell unconsciously. "Your species is weak, emotional, predictable." "Weak?" The woman's lips curved in something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so cold. "Commander, what do you know of human mythology? Primitive superstitions have no relevance to—" "Every human child knows the story of Baba Yaga," the woman continued, ignoring his interruption. "The witch who lives in the deep forests, in a house that walks on chicken legs. She who decides whether travelers live or die based on the respect they show her domain. The child in her arms stirred, looking up at his mother with eyes far too old for his young face. He whispered something in the human language, and she nodded. "My son wants to know if you've been respectful guests," she translated. "I told him no. You burned our forests. You killed our neighbors. You stole our people like livestock." "Your point, human?" "My point, Commander, is that some stories are true. Some witches are real, and some houses really do walk." The lights went out completely. Emergency power kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing everything in red. But in those 3 seconds of absolute darkness, Zexhai could have sworn he heard something that sounded like massive footsteps somewhere far below, in the deepest parts of the ship. "Sir," Vexmore's voice was strained, "engineering reports unusual readings from the ship's structural sensors. They're detecting movement patterns that don't match our current flight trajectory." "Explain." "They say it feels like something is walking around inside the hull." Zexhai stared at the human woman, who continued to sit calmly with her child. Her earlier words echoed in his mind. "Some houses really do walk. Increase security around this cell," he ordered, "and run full diagnostics on all systems." As they walked away, neither Krillian noticed the faint scratching sounds coming from within the walls, or the way the shadows seemed to move independently of the flickering lights. 3 decks below, in the ship's cargo hold, the other human prisoners huddled together in terror. But their fear wasn't directed at their Krillian captors anymore. They were staring at the walls, which had begun to sweat a dark, viscous substance that smelled of earth and old wood. One of the colonists, an elderly man named Henrik, pressed his face against the energy barrier and whispered to the Krillian guard outside. "You need to let us go," he said urgently. "You need to let her go, before she decides we're all complicit in what you've done." The guard hissed in annoyance. "Silence, slave!" "You don't understand," Henrik continued, his voice rising in panic. "She's not just any human. She's a Yaga bloodline. Do you know what that means?" "It means you're all delusional primitives who believe in fairy tales." Henrik laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We thought so too, until her family moved to our colony. Did you know plants won't grow in a perfect circle around their house? Did you know electronic equipment malfunctions if it gets too close? Did you know she once made a rainstorm stop just by asking it politely?" The guard's scales rippled with unease. "Impossible." "We tolerated her because she protected us. Crop blights ended when she walked through the fields. Wild animals never attacked our livestock. Pirates who got too close to our system just disappeared. We thought it was coincidence until today." "Until what?" "Until you took her son." The scratching in the walls grew louder, more insistent. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of massive footsteps continued, as if something enormous was pacing the corridors of the ship. Back in the command center, Zexhai received a stream of increasingly disturbing reports. Environmental systems were registering impossible readings. The ship's internal atmosphere was somehow developing pockets of what the sensors described as forest air, complete with organic compounds that shouldn't exist in space. The artificial gravity was fluctuating in patterns that defied physics, making some corridors feel like they were tilted at impossible angles. Most disturbing of all, the ship's computer kept insisting that their current location was not in deep space, but rather in a terrestrial forest, somewhere on the human colony they had left burning behind them. "Sir," the navigator reported, his voice tight with confusion, "our star charts show we're exactly where we should be, but local sensors are reading tree cover, soil composition, and animal movement. Recalibrate all sensors immediately." "We've recalibrated 17 times. The readings remain consistent." Zexhai turned to his communications officer. "Contact the rest of the fleet. Confirm our position." Minutes passed before the officer looked up, his scales pale with shock. "Sir, the fleet reports they lost contact with us 4 hours ago. According to their sensors, we don't exist. Our ship disappeared from their detection grid the moment we entered hyperspace. That's impossible. Yes, sir. But they're currently searching for debris, assuming we suffered a catastrophic drive failure. The ship shuddered suddenly, not with the vibration of engines or weapons, but with something that felt organic, like a massive heartbeat. In her cell, the human woman began to sing. It was a lullaby, sung in the human language, but every Krillian on the ship could understand it perfectly despite never hearing those words before. It spoke of houses that moved through dark forests, of witches who tested the hearts of travelers, and of what happened to those who failed that test. As she sang, the child in her arms smiled for the first time since their capture. Outside their cell, the metal walls began to sprout tiny green shoots, and the air filled with the scent of deep, old woods where ancient things still remembered how to be dangerous. Commander Zex-High stood frozen in his command center as his perfect military vessel transformed around him into something that defied every law of physics and logic he had ever known. The last thing he saw before the lights went out again was his tactical display, showing not the vast emptiness of space, but the layout of an enormous wooden house, standing on massive legs, walking through a forest that existed nowhere and everywhere at once. In the darkness, the woman's lullaby continued, and something vast and terrible began to laugh. The Krillian Empire's High Command received the distress signal at 0347 Standard Time. It was brief, fragmented, and made absolutely no sense. Command, this is Dreadnought Vexthaler. We are inside a building. Repeat, our ship is inside a building. The building is walking. The humans are doing something impossible. Request immediate. Then silence. Admiral Kethvar stared at the communication console, his ancient scales darkening with concern. In 300 years of conquest, the Krillian Empire had never lost a Dreadnought-class vessel. The Vex Thalar was equipped with enough firepower to reduce a small planet to asteroids, crewed by elite soldiers who had never known defeat. Analysis? He demanded from his staff. Sir, the signal originated from coordinates that show only empty space, reported the intelligence officer. No debris, no energy signatures, no gravitational anomalies. According to all sensors, nothing has ever existed at that location. What was the Vex Thalar's last known mission? Routine pacification of a human colony in Sector 7G. Estimated population, 2,000. Technology level, primitive. Expected resistance, minimal. Admiral Kethvar's mandibles clicked nervously. Humans were supposed to be easy prey, emotional, disorganized, technologically inferior. The Empire had conquered dozens of human colonies without significant casualties. Dispatch the 3rd Battle Group. I want answers. Captain Mordock commanded the lead ship of the 3rd Battle Group, a heavy cruiser called the Bone Render. As they approached the coordinates where the Vex Thalar had vanished, his crew remained on high alert. Losing a dreadnought to humans was like losing a war fleet to insects, theoretically impossible. Sir, we're detecting unusual energy readings ahead, reported the sensor operator. It looks like a massive structure. Structure? In empty space? Sir, you need to see this. On the main display, the impossible sight resolved into clarity. Floating in the void where no structure should exist was a house. Not a space station or orbital platform, but an actual house. Wooden walls, a shingled roof, glowing windows, and a front porch complete with what appeared to be a rocking chair, and it was moving. The house stood on 2 enormous legs, each the size of a Krillian cruiser. They were scaly and taloned like those of some massive bird, and they moved with purposeful steps through the vacuum of space as if it were solid ground. Sir, whispered the sensor operator, internal scans show the house contains the Vex Thalar. The entire dreadnought is somehow inside that structure, which is physically impossible given the size differential. Captain Mordock stared at the readings. The house was perhaps 50 meters across. The Vexthaler was over 2 kilometers long. Yet somehow the dreadnought was definitely inside the smaller structure. Open a channel to the house. Sir? You heard me. Open a channel. The view screen flickered, and suddenly they were looking into what appeared to be a cozy kitchen. Herbs hung from the rafters, a fire crackled in an enormous hearth, and the smell of baking bread somehow transmitted through the communication system. At a wooden table sat the human woman they had come to rescue their comrades from, still cradling her child. "Welcome, travelers," she said in perfect galactic standard, though her lips didn't move. Her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I was wondering when more of you would arrive. Human female, you will release our vessel immediately and surrender yourself for—" "Such poor manners," the woman interrupted, shaking her head sadly. "Do you know your friends made the same mistake? They entered my domain without permission, stole from my people, and showed no respect whatsoever." Behind her, visible through an archway, Captain Mordock could see a corridor that stretched impossibly far. Krillian soldiers wandered through it in a daze, their weapons gone, their armor tarnished and overgrown with moss. Some appeared to be sweeping floors with primitive brooms. Others were tending to plants that seemed to grow directly from the metal walls. "What have you done to them?" "I've given them purpose," the woman replied, stirring something in a large pot. "Your soldiers were very rude guests. They broke into my home, threatened my child, and tracked mud all over my clean floors, so now they're learning proper behavior. This is impossible. You're just a primitive human. You don't have the technology to—" "Technology?" The woman's laugh was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. If wind chimes could convey mortal danger. "Captain, you keep making the same error as your predecessors. You assume that what you don't understand must be impossible." The child in her arms stirred, whispering something in the human language. The woman nodded and looked back at the view screen. "My son says you have very pretty ships. He asks if you'd like to come inside for tea and cookies before you join your friends. We demand the immediate release of—" The transmission ended abruptly. On the tactical display, Captain Mordock watched in horror as the house turned to face his battle group. For a moment, they stared at each other across the void. 3 of the Empire's most advanced warships facing down what appeared to be a rustic dwelling. Then the house took a step forward, and space itself seemed to ripple around its massive feet. "All ships, open fire," Mordock commanded. Energy beams and missile salvos erupted from the battle group, enough destructive force to vaporize a small moon. The weapons struck the house and simply disappeared, as if they had been absorbed into the wooden walls without leaving so much as a scorch mark. "Impossible readings, sir," reported the weapons officer. "Our energy discharges are showing up on internal sensors. They're inside our own ship somehow." Indeed, the main corridor outside the bridge now glowed with residual weapon energy, and crew members were reporting strange phenomena throughout the vessel. Sections of the ship were developing earthen floors, metal walls were sprouting wooden beams, and the artificial atmosphere was becoming humid and forest-like. "Sir!" the communications officer called out, his voice strained. "We're receiving a transmission. It's from our own engineering section." On the screen appeared one of their own crew members, Chief Engineer Vaxil. But something was wrong with the image. The engineer was standing in what should have been the ship's power core chamber, but instead he appeared to be in a rustic workshop. Primitive tools hung from wooden walls, and a forge glowed in the corner where the main reactor should have been. "Captain," Vaxil said calmly, though his eyes held a glazed, distant quality, "the lady would like to speak with you. She says you can find her in the kitchen, down the hallway, and through the door marked, 'Stubborn Guests.' Vaxil, what's your status? How did our ship's interior change?" "Change? Sir, The engineer looked genuinely puzzled. Nothing's changed. This is how it's always been. We're in the house, Captain. We've always been in the house. The lady is very patient, but she does expect proper behavior from her guests. The transmission ended, leaving the bridge crew staring at each other in growing panic. "Sir," the navigator reported, his voice barely above a whisper, "our star charts are rewriting themselves. According to our computer, we're currently in a forest clearing on a planet that doesn't exist in any Imperial database." Captain Mordock felt his world crumbling around him. Every instrument confirmed impossible readings. Their ship was simultaneously in deep space and inside a house that was somehow larger inside than outside. His crew was being transformed into something docile and domestic. And somewhere in the bowels of his vessel, a human woman was calmly going about her daily routine as if conquering Imperial warships was just another household chore. "Sir," called out the tactical officer, "the other ships in our battle group are reporting similar phenomena. The Claw of Storms just transmitted that their captain is in someone's parlor, being served tea by his own crew." Through the bridge's main viewport, Captain Mordock could see his sister ships. They appeared normal from the outside, but he could somehow sense the wrongness inside them. The mechanical precision of military vessels being slowly, inexorably transformed into something organic and domestic. "Captain," a new voice spoke from behind him. He turned to see a young human boy standing in the center of his bridge, though no alarms had sounded and no doors had opened. The child was perhaps 10 standard years old, wearing simple clothes that seemed to be made from materials that didn't exist. Cloth woven from starlight and shadow. "My mother says you should come for dinner now," the boy said politely. "She's made your favorite meal, though you don't know it's your favorite yet. She's very good at knowing what people need, even when they don't know it themselves. How did you... security to the bridge?" "Oh, they're busy," the boy replied matter-of-factly. "Some of them are learning to bake bread, and others are practicing their stitching. Mother says idle hands lead to mischief." The bridge doors opened, and Captain Mordock's security team entered, but they moved with the same glazed calm he'd seen in his engineer. Their armor was gone, replaced by simple work clothes. They carried brooms and dusting cloths instead of weapons. "Sir," said his chief of security with serene contentment, "the house needs tidying before dinner. The lady insists on proper cleanliness. Would you like to help, or shall we escort you to the dining room?" "I am Captain Mordock of the Imperial Fleet. I demand—" "Such harsh words," the boy said sadly. "Mother doesn't like harsh words. They make the house unhappy, and when the house is unhappy, it tends to wander into very dark parts of the forest." Through the viewport, Captain Mordock could see that the stars had vanished. Instead, his ship was surrounded by towering trees whose branches seemed to reach upward forever into a sky that held no light at all. In the distance, he could hear sounds, not the mechanical hum of ship systems, but the organic noises of a living forest. Howls and rustles and things moving through undergrowth. "The deep woods are where Mother sends guests who won't learn proper behavior," the boy continued conversationally. "Some of them have been wandering out there for a very long time, looking for their way home. But there's no way home for those who won't say please and thank you." As if summoned by the child's words, the house shuddered gently, and from somewhere far below came the sound of footsteps, not the metallic ring of boots on deck plating, but the soft pad of massive feet on earthen floors. "She's coming," the boy announced with obvious pleasure. "Mother always likes to greet new guests personally. She'll want to know if you plan to be polite visitors or if you need to learn some manners first." Captain Mordock found himself backing toward his command chair, though he couldn't say why. Every rational part of his mind insisted this was impossible, that he was the victim of some advanced human technology or elaborate illusion. But a deeper, more primitive part of his consciousness recognized something far older and more dangerous than any weapon the Empire had ever faced. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a sound like wind through autumn leaves and the distant melody of a lullaby that spoke of travelers who lost their way in dark woods and the choices they faced when they finally found light in an impossible clearing. Outside the transformed ship, the house that held 3 Imperial vessels in its impossible interior continued its patient walk through space that had become a forest, carrying its new guests deeper into woods where the old rules still applied. And courtesy was not just polite behavior, but the difference between salvation and being lost forever in the spaces between the trees. Emperor Drexmorth the Conqueror had ruled the Krillian Empire for 2 centuries. He had personally overseen the subjugation of 47 species and the destruction of countless worlds. His throne room was decorated with the bones of kings who had dared oppose him, and his crown was forged from the melted weapons of defeated armies. He had never known fear. Until today. "Your Imperial Magnificence," General Kexthor reported, his scales trembling. "We have lost contact with all vessels dispatched to Sector 7G, 17 ships including 2 dreadnoughts and a battle group. No wreckage, no distress signals after the initial reports. They simply vanish." 17 ships, the Emperor repeated, his voice a low growl that made the throne room's massive pillars vibrate. "Lost to a primitive human colony with a population of 2,000. "Yes, Your Magnificence. The last transmission we received was unusual. Elaborate." General Kexthor activated a holographic display. The image was grainy and distorted, but it clearly showed the bridge of an Imperial cruiser. The crew moved with strange, placid expressions, performing what appeared to be domestic chores. They were dusting furniture that looked distinctly non-military and hanging laundry from control panels. "This was transmitted from the battlecruiser Void Render," the general continued. The message accompanying it was, "The house sends its regards and requests that no more visitors arrive uninvited. The children are trying to sleep." Emperor Drexmorth stared at the impossible image. In the background of the transmission, barely visible, was what appeared to be a human child skipping down a corridor that should have been filled with weapon systems. "Assemble the Grand Fleet," he ordered. "I will deal with this personally." "Your Magnificence, perhaps." "Silence!" The Emperor's roar shattered 3 windows and caused several courtiers to collapse. "No primitive species mocks the Empire. We will reduce that entire system to cosmic dust." What the Emperor didn't know was that his words were heard far beyond the throne room, carried by winds that blew between stars and whispered through forests that existed in spaces where physics held no dominion. In a kitchen that was larger inside than outside, a woman paused in her bread-making and sighed. "He's not going to listen, is he?" she asked her son, who was coloring at the wooden table. His drawing showed spaceships being very politely asked to leave by a house with chicken legs. "Nope," the boy replied without looking up. "He's too proud, like the others." The woman nodded sadly and walked to her window. Outside, she could see the 17 Imperial ships that had become permanent fixtures in her yard. They rested among her garden plots like enormous metal sculptures, their crews contentedly tending to vegetables and maintaining what had once been weapon systems but were now farming equipment. "How many more do you think will come?" she asked. "Lots," the boy said matter-of-factly. "But it's okay. The house likes visitors, even rude ones, and they all learn eventually." 3 days later, the largest fleet in Krillian history arrived at the coordinates where 17 ships had vanished. The Grand Fleet consisted of over 300 vessels, including the Emperor's personal flagship, the Death of Worlds. It was a mobile fortress the size of a small moon, equipped with weapons capable of destroying entire star systems. Emperor Drexmorth stood on his command deck, surrounded by his most elite generals and admirals. Every warrior present had conquered multiple worlds and commanded forces that had never known defeat. Analysis, the Emperor demanded. Sir, sensors detect the same impossible structure reported by previous expeditions, Admiral Kethvar reported. A house-like building, approximately 50 meters in length, suspended in space and exhibiting locomotive behavior via what appear to be massive organic appendages. On the main display, the house came into view. It looked utterly ridiculous next to the massive war fleet, a tiny wooden cottage facing down the assembled might of an empire. The Emperor's mandibles clicked in what passed for Krillian laughter. That insignificant structure is what destroyed my fleet? Sir, internal scans suggest the presence of our missing vessels within the structure, despite the apparent size impossibility. Then we will simply destroy it. Emperor Drexmorth turned to his weapons coordinator. Target the structure with all primary batteries. Total annihilation. Sir, what about our missing crews? They allowed themselves to be captured by primitives. They have forfeited their right to rescue. The order was given. 300 ships opened fire simultaneously. The combined firepower was enough to crack a planet's crust and boil its oceans. Energy beams and projectiles that could punch through space-time itself converged on the small wooden house. The weapons struck their target and simply disappeared. Report, the Emperor demanded. Sir, the weapons coordinator replied, his voice hollow with disbelief. Our weapons are gone. Sensors indicate the energy discharges have relocated. Relocated where? Throughout the fleet, sir. Every ship is reporting internal weapon discharges appearing randomly in corridors, quarters, and common areas. No damage, sir, but crew members are reporting that the energy feels warm, comforting, like sunlight. Emperor Drexmorth felt the first stirring of unease. Continue firing! Wave after wave of destructive force was hurled at the house, only to vanish without effect. Meanwhile, throughout the Grand Fleet, strange phenomena began manifesting. Corridors developed wooden floors and walls lined with family portraits of species no one recognized. The harsh artificial lighting was replaced by the warm glow of fireplaces that appeared from nowhere. The recycled ship air began to smell of baking bread and growing things. Sir, reported the fleet's chief medical officer, crews throughout the fleet are reporting improved morale and decreased stress levels. Many are expressing unfamiliar urges to tidy up their quarters and be more polite to their fellow crew members. Medical analysis? Unknown, sir, but whatever's happening appears to be beneficial to crew health and psychological well-being. Emperor Drexmorth was about to respond when his communications officer looked up with a puzzled expression. Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the structure. It's an invitation. Explain. A dinner invitation, sir. Addressed to the cranky gentleman with the fancy hat and all his friends. It includes directions to the front door and requests that we please wipe your feet before entering. The Emperor stared at his crew, wondering if he was hallucinating. Put it on screen. The display showed the interior of the same kitchen they had seen in previous transmissions. The human woman stood at her stove, stirring something that smelled incredible even through the communications system. Her child sat at the table working on what appeared to be homework. Good evening, Your Imperial Majesty, the woman said without turning around. I've prepared dinner for you and your people. I do hope you like pot roast. It's always been a favorite among travelers. Human female, you will surrender immediately and— Oh dear, the woman interrupted, finally turning to face the screen. Her expression was that of a patient teacher dealing with a particularly slow student. Such terrible manners. And after I went to all the trouble of setting extra places at the table. Behind her, visible through the kitchen window, Emperor Drexmorth could see his missing ships. They sat in what appeared to be an enormous garden. their hulls covered in flowering vines. Krillian soldiers moved peacefully among them, tending to plants and chatting amiably with each other. "What have you done to my forces?" "I've given them something they never had before," the woman replied, turning back to her cooking. "A home." "This is impossible. You are a primitive species. You don't have the technology to—" "There you go again with technology," the woman sighed. "Your Majesty, you've spent so long conquering and destroying that you've forgotten there are older powers in the universe than fusion reactors and energy weapons." The child looked up from his homework. "Mother, the Emperor's fleet is really big. Do we have enough food?" "Of course, dear. The pantry always provides what's needed." She turned back to the communications screen. "Your Majesty, you have a choice. You can continue trying to destroy my home with your weapons, which won't work and will only make you frustrated. Or you can accept my invitation, come in for dinner, and we can discuss this like civilized people." "I am Emperor Dreximorth the Conqueror. I do not negotiate with primitives." "And I," the woman replied calmly, "am just a mother trying to raise her child in peace. But when uninvited guests show up at my door, behaving rudely and threatening my family, I tend to get protective." As she spoke, the house shuddered gently. Through the viewports of his flagship, Emperor Drexmorth could see that the massive chicken legs beneath the structure were moving, carrying the house closer to his fleet. "Sir," his navigator reported, voice tight with panic, "the structure is approaching at impossible speeds. It's stepping between our ships." The Emperor watched in growing horror as the house walked through his fleet like a giant among toys. Each footstep somehow avoided crushing any vessels, but the massive talons passed close enough to his ships that crews could see the ancient scales that covered them. "All ships retreat," he commanded. "Sir, engines are not responding. All vessels report power systems converting to domestic heating units." Throughout the Grand Fleet, the transformation was accelerating. Weapon systems became ovens and stoves. Bridge controls converted to furniture. Crew quarters developed comfortable beds with hand-sewn quilts. The harsh military efficiency of Imperial vessels gave way to something warmer and more nurturing. "Sir," his communications officer called out, "we're receiving individual transmissions from ship captains throughout the fleet." On screen, a dozen windows opened, showing various ship commanders. But like the crews they had seen before, these seasoned warriors looked content. Their military bearing had softened into something approaching domestic happiness. "Your Majesty," said Captain Vexisthaler of the dreadnought Iron Talon, "the lady has invited us all for dinner. The food smells absolutely wonderful, and she's promised to show us her garden afterward. Some of the crew are learning to knit." "Knit?" "Yes, sir. It's remarkably soothing. Also, my ship's weapons have been converted into the most efficient kitchen equipment I've ever seen. The crew morale has never been higher." Emperor Dreximorth cut the transmission and turned to his personal guard. "Prepare my shuttle. I will face this creature myself." "Sir, perhaps—" "No. I will not be mocked by a primitive human. I will tear her apart with my bare claws." The Emperor's shuttle approached the house's front porch, which had somehow extended itself to provide a convenient landing platform. As he disembarked, the Emperor noticed that his armor felt heavier than usual, and his weapons seemed oddly reluctant to draw from their holsters. The front door opened before he could knock, revealing the human woman. Up close, she was smaller than he had expected, barely reaching his chest. But her eyes held depths that reminded him of the space between stars. "Welcome to my home, Your Majesty," she said politely. "Please come in. Dinner is ready, and there's so much we need to discuss." Despite every instinct screaming danger, Emperor Drexmorth found himself stepping across the threshold. The moment his foot touched the wooden floor, he felt something fundamental shift around him. The house was larger inside than outside, filled with corridors that led to rooms that couldn't possibly exist. The air smelled of growing things and home-cooked meals and safety in a way that the sterile atmosphere of his ships never had. "Your Majesty," the woman continued, leading him toward the kitchen. "Before we eat, I think you should meet some of your former soldiers. They've been helping me with the household chores, and they have some interesting things to tell you about what it means to serve." In the kitchen, seated around an enormous wooden table, were dozens of Krillian soldiers from his missing ships. They looked up as he entered, and to his shock, they smiled. Not the predatory grins of successful hunters, but genuine expressions of contentment and peace. "Your Majesty," called out Commander Zexhai, whom the Emperor had presumed dead. "Come sit. The lady makes the most incredible bread, and she's been teaching us about cooperation and community. Did you know that working together for mutual benefit is actually more efficient than conquest and domination?" Emperor Drexmorth stared at his veteran commander, speechless. "Oh yes," the woman said, taking her place at the head of the table. "Your people are quite intelligent once they're not constantly focused on violence and acquisition. Amazing what they can accomplish when they're building instead of destroying." She gestured to an empty chair beside her. "Please sit. My son has been looking forward to meeting you. He has questions about why you thought it was acceptable to steal people from their homes." The child looked up from his plate, regarding the Emperor with curious eyes. "Why do you hurt people?" he asked simply. Emperor Drexmorth found himself sitting down, though he couldn't remember deciding to do so. We conquer because we are strong, because we can." "But why?" the boy persisted. "Don't you have enough stuff already? Mama says taking things from people who need them is wrong. I rule an empire, child. I command thousands of worlds. Do the people on those worlds like you?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Emperor Drexamorth opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. In 2 centuries of rule, no one had ever asked him that question. "It doesn't matter if they like me," he said finally. "They obey." "That sounds lonely," the boy observed. Around the table, his former soldiers were nodding. Commander Zexhai spoke up. "Your Majesty, these people have shown us something we never experienced in the Empire. They've shown us what it feels like to be valued for who we are, not just what we can destroy." "This is impossible," the Emperor muttered. "You are warriors. You live for conquest." "Did we?" asked another soldier. "Or did we conquer, because we never knew there was any other way to live?" The woman placed a plate in front of the Emperor. The food smelled incredible, and despite himself, he found his mouth watering. When was the last time he had eaten something prepared with care, rather than merely consumed for sustenance? "Your Majesty," the woman said gently, "I want you to understand something. You came to my home, threatened my family, and enslaved my neighbors. By all rights, I should have sent you into the deep woods where the lost things go. Why didn't you?" "Because my son asked me not to. He said you looked sad." The Emperor stared at the child, who was calmly eating his dinner. "Sad?" "Very sad," the boy confirmed. "Like you forgot how to be happy and couldn't remember how to learn." For the first time in centuries, Emperor Drexmorth felt something crack inside his chest. It was a feeling he didn't recognize at first, because he had buried it so deeply under layers of conquest and cruelty. It was loneliness. "I don't understand," he whispered. "You don't have to understand," the woman replied. "Not yet. But you can choose to learn. All your people can choose to learn. There's room in my house for everyone who's willing to treat others with kindness and respect." "And if we refuse?" The woman's expression grew sad. "Then you'll wander in the deep woods until you decide you're ready to come home. The choice is always yours." Emperor Drexmorth looked around the table at his soldiers, who were engaged in animated conversations about gardening and cooking and how to make furniture that would last for generations. They looked happy. Actually happy in a way he had never seen in all his years of ruling through fear. "I still don't understand how this is possible," he said. The woman smiled. "Your Majesty, you've spent so long focusing on what you can take that you forgot about what you could give. You've been so busy conquering space that you forgot about the magic that lives in the spaces between heartbeats, in the kindness between strangers, in the love between a mother and child. Magic isn't real, isn't it?" She gestured around the impossible house. "You're sitting in a building that's larger inside than outside, that can walk between stars and hold an entire fleet in its living room. Your weapons don't work here, but bread rises perfectly every time. Your soldiers are learning to create instead of destroy. If that's not magic, what would you call it?" Emperor Drexmorth had no answer for that. "The choice is yours," the woman continued. "You can return to your remaining ships, continue trying to conquer and destroy, and eventually your empire will collapse under the weight of its own cruelty. Or you can stay for dessert, learn about cooperation and community, and discover what it means to build something that lasts." The emperor looked at his former soldiers, then at the child who had seen sadness where others saw only power. For the first time in 2 centuries, he considered a possibility he had never imagined. "What," he asked quietly, "would happen to my empire?" "It would become something better," the woman replied. "Something that creates instead of destroys. Something that protects instead of conquers. Something that your people can be proud of instead of afraid of." Outside the kitchen windows, the emperor could see his grand fleet. The ships floated peacefully among garden plots, their crews visible through viewports as they worked on projects that seemed to involve building rather than weapons maintenance. "They look content," he observed. "They are," the woman confirmed. "For the first time in their lives, they're using their strength to help instead of hurt. They're discovering talents they never knew they had because all their energy was focused on war." The child finished his dinner and looked up at the emperor. "Would you like to see my room? I have books about adventures where the heroes save people instead of conquering them." Emperor Drexmorth stared at the small human child who had somehow seen through centuries of armor and anger to the lonely creature underneath. He thought about his empty throne room, his empire built on fear, his legacy of destruction. Then he thought about his soldiers learning to knit and garden, working together with genuine smiles on their faces. "Yes," he heard himself say. "I think I would like that very much." As they left the kitchen, the woman called after them. "Dessert will be ready in an hour. It's apple pie, my grandmother's recipe. She always said the secret ingredient was making it for people you care about." For the first time in his long, violent life, Emperor Drexmorth the Conqueror understood what she meant. Outside the house, among the gardens where a fleet had learned to grow flowers instead of making war, the Krillian Empire began its transformation into something the galaxy had never seen before. A civilization that measured its success not by what it could destroy, but by what it could nurture into bloom. And in a kitchen that existed everywhere and nowhere, a mother smiled as she heard genuine laughter echoing through corridors that led to rooms full of former enemies who were learning to become friends.